You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Hello and welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm one of your co-hosts, Henry Huckenacki, joined as usual by my co-hosts, Professor Adnan Hussain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. How are you today, Adnan?
Hi, Henry.
And Brett O'Shea, host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of the Red Menace podcast. Hello, Brett.
Hello, Henry.
Nice to have you both here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have coming up. So today our guest is Vijay Prashad, who is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, is the author of many books, including The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and Red Star Over the Third World. But today he's going to be gracious enough to talk about his newest book, which is just out. It's called Washington Bullets. It's out from Left Word Books. That's Left, W-O-R-D, Books. And it talks about the history of U.S. intervention, CIA coups, and the like across the world. And what I think was a really, really interesting and thought-provoking book. So before Vijay comes on, let's talk about our general thoughts of the book, some of the things that we thought were particularly interesting, and some of the questions that it kind of raised for us. And then we'll bring Vijay on and we'll have a conversation with him about his book, Washington Bullets. So, Brett, Adnan, what were your thoughts on Washington Bullets, Brett?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead and start this off. I love the book. Obviously, it's a sort of broad overview of the patterns of American imperialism, touching on a bunch of different stuff without getting lost in the details of any one specific event. One thing that really comes through, and something that I really like to reiterate, is that you have to, it really helps to understand the CIA as the organized crime branch of the American ruling class. Their job is to go about the world, not to promote freedom and democracy like American ideology and American ideologues like to pretend that American governments do, but actually as a force of evil, as a force of anti-democracy in the world, all in the name, ultimately, of multinational corporations and their profits, which own the American government. So understanding the CIA not as just a intelligence agency with some good and bad things, but really as the organized crime branch of the American ruling class, I think is essential here. And another thing I thought about when I was reading through this book, which, occurs to me often, is it's funny in the American context when you have American patriots, American nationalists. And I've noticed a relationship where the more of a patriot someone is in the U.S., the less they actually know about American history, the more of like a childlike, naive, middle school level, and idealist conception of American history that they tend to have. And if you do, in those extremely rare cases, come across somebody who truly understands American history with real clarity and still supports it, you're talking almost entirely to a fascist and an imperialist. The history of America is truly a brutal one. And, we're just going to drive that point home today, I think.
Well, this was a very interesting and readable book. In a short period of time, he manages to cover the patterns, really, as Brett was saying, of U.S. imperial intervention. But one thing that I really liked about the book was how it grounded his analysis in a period even before the U.S. becomes the predominating global superpower in the post-World War II period, to set up the way in which colonialism and imperialism of an earlier era set up some of the structures that really inform how the world is organized today, and a lot of the views and ideas about the dangers of colonial peoples seeking their democratic and economic rights has been, and how that continued under the U.S. with new forms and patterns where the U.S. really sort of perfected the way of intervening in this new global order post-World War II. I think it's also a terrific companion to a book you mentioned that was very important and influential when it came out, The Darker Nations. That book really went through a lot of the history of the Third World movements, anti-imperialism, and talked about a lot of these histories. And what we're getting in this book, it seems to me, is a lot of the analysis about how and why and the patterns of intervention of how those movements, anti-imperial, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist movements, were derailed and have been by U.S. intervention. So it's a really good companion piece, I think, to The Darker Nations.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And one thing I want to highlight is what Adnan just said about readability. The readability of this book is extremely high. I think that this is a book that anybody can take and really take a lot from. It's written in a way that it focuses on highlights without getting lost in flowery language or getting too deep into any specific event. It really is a good through line of the history of U.S. intervention abroad without getting too mired down in either language or details, because there is so much that you could cover. And of course, a lot of authors like to write in very flowery prose, but Vijay here does an excellent job of just presenting things to you in a way that really makes you learn new things, find new events, and really think about how these things work. And another thing that I think was really interesting is that, as Adnan also said, it looks at before the U.S. was the predominant power in the world, or as he says many times, before they had preponderant power in the world, and almost tracks us back to the foundation of America as a nation back in 1776, but especially since the Monroe Doctrine. And you really get this through line, and you see the changes in methodology that the U.S. as a state used over time to intervene in these foreign lands. One of the through lines that you see in this methodology is it goes from tanks to banks to NGOs to lawfare, and the U.S. kind of has adapted its methodology over time, because some of the methods that they used to do, either they found were ineffective or became ineffective over time, because these nations that they were trying to intervene in became wise to the methods that the U.S. were using, and then the U.S. had to adapt its methodology in order to exert the same sort of influence that it had previously. So this book really did an excellent job of showing this transition of methodology in a way that was understandable for everyone. Adnan?
I think this is a really good book for inaugurating the podcast in some ways, because it does cover a lot of ground, and because it is meant to really revive a sense of histories that have been suppressed. Something I'd like to hear him talk a little bit further about are the methods and approaches to really digging up this history from the sorts of sources that you have to. But I think he said something really valuable that characterizes the project of the book that I think is really the project also of our conversation with him and of this podcast. He says on page 53, militant struggle, about the militant struggle of the Tricontinental. Democracy in Portugal and in South Africa was taken by the gun. It was not given by liberalism. Those narratives are now submerged. It has to be revived. Not just the sounds of the battlefield, but also the stories of the doctors and the technicians of the revolutionary educational programs in Mozambique and Cape Verde, the attempt to build a new society out of the detritus of the colonial order. This was the revolutionary energy that is now forgotten. And that's why we need these sorts of histories to revive a sense of those stories that have been suppressed. And that's, I think, also the project of this podcast, Guerrilla History.
Yeah, and just to add one quick thing on there. So I had a note from basically the same segment as you. And this, again, is the understanding of guerrilla history and understanding that events aren't static or monolithic. So you mentioned these struggles in these former Portuguese territories. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that he pointed out and that I wasn't quite aware of, and a lot of us wouldn't be aware of, is that for a long time, the struggles in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde were nonviolent. The PAIGC had nonviolent movements to try to decolonialize themselves from Portugal, but because of massacres of villagers, because of massacres of dock workers, etc., by Portugal, that was what forced the armed struggle. But if you look at just history text writ large, they would focus on the armed struggle as what overthrew the Portuguese colonization of these areas, not understanding that there was a transition there, that it wasn't just people overnight took up arms. There really was this being pushed by the Portuguese. And I think that understanding things like this are really important to understanding the history more wholly. Brett, let's pitch it over to you. Was there anything in here that really caught you that you weren't aware of, or something that really raised some questions that you're planning on asking Vijay when we bring him on?
Well, I did want to mention that the whole sort of pattern of U.S. imperialism, the way it rose to superpower status and the way it evolved over time, which I think both of you have alluded to so far, really speaks to the nature of this whole thing being a historical process of counter-revolution around the globe. It's very interesting to see how he talks about, and maybe we'll get into the interview, that although we think of the Cold War period as this East and West sort of contradiction, he really flips that around and says it's actually a global North versus global South contradiction. And a lot of this Cold War battles, they obviously didn't happen with the U.S. taking on the USSR head on. They were through proxy battles, often in the global South. It also speaks to the heroic nature of so many just regular people around the world who, exhausted every effort they could just to have basic rights, basic say over their own life, basic control over their own resources, and just how brutally and unforgiving the U.S. government and its allies treat these people around the world. And one thing that's always been close to my heart, and one thing I hope maybe even Guerrilla History can touch on in the future, is the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. He mentions it and he talks about in the aftermath, and it's fascinating. But to drill down on just how unprecedented that was, just how monstrous that act was, just how unnecessary it really was. He touches on this fact that Japan was already on the ropes. They were already about to really give up, and not one but two of these bombs, and they were just wholeheartedly aimed at city centers. And of course, the history of World War II has plenty of that, but I find that act of barbarism particularly striking, and really as this opening salvo of what we now know as the Cold War. We really have to think about that dropping of the atomic bombs as the U.S. flexing to the Soviet Union and saying, now that World War II is coming to an end, like you're the enemy. And things like Operation Paperclip, where the U.S. extracted a bunch of Nazi intellectuals and scientists to start their war effort against the Soviet Union. I think all that history is fascinating and really deserves its own sort of deep dive at some point.
Yeah, so one of the things that you touched on, I think, is something else that we're going to want to bring up. So you talk about Operation Paperclip and extracting Nazis. And, there was something else that I was completely unaware of, is how religious institutions were doing essentially the same thing, where they were extracting Nazis from Germany after World War II and bringing them to various places, harboring them and allowing them to take a foothold in other places, particularly in Latin America. But yeah, I just also want to emphasize what Brett said, that this thinking of the Cold War is not really being a Cold War East-West, US, USSR, but rather a global North, global South, colonialism versus decolonialism or anti-colonialism was really something that, caught me. I guess it shouldn't have caught me by surprise, but something that really was eye-opening for me. Adnan, I'll let you have more or less the last word before we bring in Vijay. So anything else that you want to raise in our introduction for before Vijay comes on?
Well, it's a book with so many different dimensions and aspects. We could ask him about many, many things. I think I'll be interested. You alluded to religious institutions. I think in this book he also talks about liberation theology as a counter force, a religious movement that was on the side of people and also had to be suppressed in various ways. And I think that's an interesting topic to broaden out, is the ways in which religious movements worked on both sides of this, but also just fundamentally, he concludes the book. It's a little bit dark, this story of all of the Washington bullets, all of the ways in which U.S. imperialism has derailed movements around the world for liberation and social justice. And so I just wondered at the end, maybe if he had any thoughts. I would like to ask him about not just necessarily naive or vain hope, but whether or not the rebalancing of the world, now that the United States may not be such a predominating power, even if militarily it's very strong, if there is a rebalancing of the world that might provide opportunities and options for future revolutionary and liberatory struggles around the world.
Absolutely. So I think that we're all in agreement that the book was absolutely worth our while to read. It was a very fast read and very eye-opening. And I think that I can safely say that we're all recommending that the listeners, everyone, go look into grabbing the Washington Bullets. You're not going to regret it. And just final thing before we bring in Vijay, the mention of liberation theology, I believe it was the second newest episode of Brett's Rev Left Radio had an episode on liberation theology, a pretty deep dive into it. So if you're listening to this and you haven't yet listened to Brett's Rev Left Radio episode on liberation theology, give that a look, because that was an excellent episode. And I think that having people cross-pollinate between these shows really will give them a deeper understanding, because, of course, an episode on that specifically is going to be far more in-depth than anything that we're going to be able to cover with Vijay on liberation theology coming up. So give that a listen, and we'll be right back with Vijay Prashad. Welcome back to Guerrilla History. We're now joined by our very, very special and inaugural guest, Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. As I mentioned before in the introduction, Vijay is the author of many, many books, something like 3 books at this point, including some really important works like The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and Red Star Over the Third World. But today, Vijay is going to be talking to us about his newest book, which we've already introduced, Washington Bullets, which is now out from Leftward Books. That's WORD, Leftward Books. And Vijay, I guess to get us into it, I'm going to mention the fact that Washington Bullets' preface was written by none other than Evo Morales. And at the time of recording, we're now just a couple days divorced from Mas being victorious at the polls in Bolivia. So I know that we're going to get back to Bolivia, by the end of the conversation. But do you have anything that you want to get out there early on? And how did you get Evo Morales to write the preface to the book?
Well, it's great to be with you, and I like the idea of a guerrilla podcast. It's super. It brings back all kinds of emotions and evocations. It evokes our rearguard action to bring good ideas to good people and make more people good people. Really, to make the majority good people. It's not easy being good in this world, and I think. The task of intellectual activity is to try to expand this sense that it's possible to be good and it's possible to be a decent person. That's part of our task, I think. And this brings me directly to the fact that there was a coup against the government of Evo Morales Ayma in November, beginning in October of 2019 and then in November. During that period, lots of people, not only in Latin America, but worse, in the overseas, particularly Western left, lots of people felt that this was not a coup. And they felt that Evo Morales had made lots of mistakes and therefore somehow deserved what was happening to him. I was surprised to read so-called think pieces written on websites of, what purport to be left periodicals, and there's no need to mention them. They know who they are, making the kinds of gestures that suggested that they would be happy to be weaponized by the CIA against a movement of the people in Bolivia, which is the movement to socialism, which was in government and whose term was not going to expire till January of 2020. And yet, when Evo Morales was removed from office in November 2019 by a military action, even liberals, constitutional liberals, who should have said, look, he should be allowed to serve out his term till January, even if the election of October 2019 is in doubt, it was not based on that election that his term went till January. But even constitutional liberals and people of the so-called left started saying, well, it's good. There was fraud in the election, they said, believing the Organization of American States. And that really struck me as peculiar and disturbing. And I decided that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to now, apart from all the other things I do, I'm not going to go to bed for the next 3 weeks, and I'm going to write this book. And I literally wrote this book in a feverish pace. I have, great fond memories of Eduardo Galeano. And I remember very well Galeano saying that there are times when it's our job just to do things. You thinking at that moment, I'm angry at what's happening. People don't understand the history of how coups happen. They don't understand what the OAS is. They don't understand the CIA, or maybe they're being deliberately opaque about their knowledge, But Galeano, I remember, said many times, sometimes you just have to say it again, like his books on torture. You just have to say it again. It's not like entire generations don't know what the junta did in Argentina and Uruguay and Chile and Brazil. And yet Eduardo went and wrote brilliant books over and over again, because you just have to do it. And I said to myself, you just got to do it. And I sat down and I just wrote this book at a fever pitch. And I said, I'm writing it for young militants because we need armor. We cannot afford to have amnesia against, 60, 70 years of the history of the CIA and what they've done, what the CIA has done, not like one person here and one person there. This institution which continues to exist, what this institution has done, it has to be there. Now, of course, there are a million books in the library. Of course, there are many, many synthetic accounts sitting somewhere or the other. That doesn't matter. What did Galeano say? You just got to do it. You got to say it again and again and again, because the battle of ideas is adverse. We haven't made the point, And so many of these books are 500 pages long because the crimes of the CIA are so significant. So I said, I'm going to write a 100-page book which is going to tell the whole story. I'm somehow going to do this. In 100 pages, I'm going to just indict the CIA from its founding till the present. And, I'm going to tell you, in a month and a bit, I had a draft. And I said, Evo has to write the forward to this. And he agreed, because he was sitting in Argentina and had just been overthrown in a coup. And when, I said, this book is called Washington Bullets because I've been waiting to write a book with that name, Washington Bullets. And I went for a walk and I had my headphones on and I was listening to music and I put it to a recording app and I basically just said and I haven't even edited this, I just said, what is the price of an assassin's bullet? Some dollars here and there, the cost of the bullet, the cost of a train ride, a hotel, an airplane. I just started speaking this. This is totally unedited, the first part. It's exactly the whole of that first paragraph was basically me pissed off talking into my phone while I was just walking around. And I came back and I transcribed it and I said, that's it. And when I sent it, a preface has to be done, and it was done. And if you see the preface, the last line of the preface from Evo Morales, he says, last two lines, we have the conviction that we are the masses and that the masses over time will win. This was written in April. Here's a man who has his finger on the pulse of his people.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess to get us moving into the book itself now, and then that'll open up opportunities for the guys to jump in and start asking questions. But I want to just at a quote from that little section that you were talking about in regards to Washington bullets. And you're talking about, what is the price of a bullet? It's not the price of the raw materials. It's not the price of production. It's the price of what did it cost, that bullet, to the people that bullet was used on. And you said, quote, in Indonesia, the price of the bullet was in the millions. In Guatemala, the tens of thousands. The death of Lumumba damaged the social dynamic of the Congo, muzzling its history. What did it cost to kill Chokri Belaid and Ruth First? What did it take to kill Amilcar Cabral and Berta Cáceres? I mean, it's amazing that we don't often think of what the cost of these actions were to the people in these areas. And we also don't understand a lot of the times that it's not necessarily as simple as a bullet. And I think that this brings us to one of the key points of your book is what you were calling the Manual for Regime Change, which was a 9-step program. And I'm just going to read out the 9 steps, and then I'll have you comment on it, and the guys will be able to, bounce back and forth off of you. So you have your Manual for Regime Change. 1, lobby public opinion. 2, appoint the right man on the ground. 3, make sure the generals are ready. 4, make the economy scream. 5, diplomatic isolation. 6, organize mass protests. 7, green light. 8, a study of assassination. And 9, deny. There's this whole through line for these movements. So, Vijay, I guess why am I talking? We have you on. Why don't you comment on that?
Well, you see, the first thing is that it's not like I need to make up anything. And really the advantage here is that because the United States is, a half-baked democracy, there are rules that some materials need to be made public after a certain amount of time. Plus there's, the Freedom of Information Act, opportunity available to you. With the U.S. coup against Jacob Arbenz' government in Guatemala, you actually don't even need to use the Freedom of Information Act because it's just all online. Everything is available. All the information I got on that coup, I got as PDFs from the CIA library, from the State Department library. It's all online. So I said, again, Greg Grandin has written, there's so many people have written terrific books about the Guatemala coup. It's all there. But what I was interested in is to use the Guatemala coup to try to create the methodology of the coup d'etat. Like, what's the methodology? What are the pieces of the coup? If you just tell the narrative of the coup, it looks like, well, that's about Guatemala 53. I was not interested in the narrative of that coup, the conjuncture of that coup. I was interested in the structure of regime change. And that's a theoretical concern. That's not a concern on the level of empirical. But in order to produce the theory in a credible way, you need enough valid empirical information. And rather than go and interview the victims whose opinions can be discarded, as they often are, I just took the CIA's own texts. And if the CIA is to be believed, if you look at their own text, this is what they say they did, then this is the methodology that they operate with. And it's not just merely in Guatemala, which is why I interspersed it. I bring in Guyana, I bring in different coups, and, tell the story in such a way that if the reader is reading with care, then they will notice that Bolivia 2019 follows the exact script. You just need to read about Guatemala and you understand Bolivia. And that's chilling because that means from 1953 to 2019, the CIA has basically been using the same manual. And it's not just the CIA. I mean, in Colombia today, in the northern part of South America, almost every day a social movement leader is killed. And, you get sporadic information about this, the death of and they're often Afro-Colombian. This leader killed, that leader killed, local leaders. And the thing is, you got to understand, if your local leader is killed, it's almost that for a generation, politics in that area is destroyed. Because it's not just the loss of that individual. Everybody else is made terrified. And they just don't want to put their head above water. When you kill one person, you can terrify a community. And that's the sort of homeopathic use of violence by imperialism that needs to be really grasped. What they did in Indonesia was they killed over 1 million people and totally dismantled the left movement in that country for generations, till today, dismantled it. In the Congo, they just actually needed to kill Lumumba in public, as it were, just kill him in public. And then Mobutu comes in and they killed a lot of other people. Let's not be imprecise about this. It's not like only one person was killed, but the death of Lumumba, just like the death of Sankara in 1987 in Burkina Faso, the death of Sankara, these things had a role much beyond the death of an individual. It actually, it takes decades to build up the confidence of a people to confront authority. Decades. In many societies, it takes generations to lift your head up to authority. I'm talking physically. For generations, people were beaten so that they wouldn't raise their eyes to people in power. I'm talking, they wouldn't look powerful people in the eye. And by the way, I'm not talking about the medieval world. I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about in countries that are wherever. I'm talking even in the advanced industrial countries. A janitor walks into a building, there's a banker sitting in his glass office. The janitor doesn't make eye contact with that banker because they're afraid of that banker and whether they'll fire them. So it takes decades, generations to build confidence, and that one bullet, that one person taken out can set the confidence back, a long time. And that's what I wanted to explain to people, that, and what's amazing about Bolivia in this period is that the overthrow of Morales, what they did to Patricia Arce, they cut her hair off, they painted her face red, they brutalized her. You know what? She's back as a senator. She is back as a senator. The Bolivians have given me so much complete confidence. In a way, they've completely negated the thesis that you overthrow somebody and there's confidence lost for generations. And I salute them. Please prove me wrong. I want to be wrong because I want you so badly to be right.
Adnan, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, it's just very interesting. One question I did have for you, and I'm so glad to hear you talk about the inspiring examples that resistance to Washington bullets, can perform for us, because in some ways it's such a depressing history, right? To see the pattern of regime change that you identify, and it was very useful to have that crystallized through all of those examples. But then, you have a sense that they've been running this game very successfully for, since World War II. What is the possibility? You began the book talking a little bit about how hope is a very important resource for resistance. But in reading, the stories and the patterns of successfully derailing of these popular movements for justice around the Third World, you're left at the end just with that sense that, yes, we stand for life and justice, but where do we see, from your perspective, the opportunities or the possibilities for successful resistance out of the history that you've shared with us?
Yeah, so, it's not an easy question to answer, because if it were easy, then the world would be a different place.
Of course.
I think the thing that gives us hope and resilience, perhaps, is reflected in a line that you will not believe it was passed by the UN General Assembly in the 1960s. In their resolution on decolonization, there's a beautiful line which I use all over the place, and I quote it in here. The line is, "The process of liberation is irresistible." That's such a great line. It was in a UN resolution. It's poetic. The process of liberation is irresistible. You can't resist it. It doesn't say it's going to win. It's irresistible. And so what's important is that humans just keep coming up. I mean, it's that old anarchist song, right? What is it? You can't knock me down. I keep standing. What's the hell is that song? That stupid dance number by the anarchist band. I get knocked down, but I get up again.
There you go.
You know, I get knocked down, but I get up again. You know, you just can't keep me down. And I feel like there's something quite powerful in that. And I'm not one of those that romanticizes struggle for its sake. I want to win. You know, I actually want to win. I don't want to just say, look, what's great is that we struggle. I think that's extraordinarily, that's you say that from a point of luxury. Because there are people who can't eat and go to bed. Their children go to bed at night. They want to win. They don't just want to struggle for the sake of it. They want to win. And I believe we can win. But I also believe that you can't keep us down. You know, I get knocked down, but I get up again. And there's something powerful in that. And I have to say that just in terms of the prose, I tried my best not to write the prose so that it was from the standpoint of Langley and the CIA. I wanted very much to write the prose so that it was from the standpoint of a young kid looking out of the window saying that, aha, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to throw a rock through your military jeep. And I'm going to do that because I want you to know that right now I might not be able to overthrow your government, but soon I will. And that was the mode that I was going for. That young kid, you know, he or she sitting there looking out of their window saying, I'm going to do something now because your days are numbered.
So in a way, it's sort of you're saying that this was intended as a resource for activists. This history should be a resource. In fact, it is guerrilla history. You know, it's a history that will impel the young activist to fight back and to believe and have some confidence that the struggle can be victorious. It can be achieved.
But in a way, Adnan, for me personally, this has been my quest for the last 20 plus years in the sense that, you know, and it shows. I wrote a PhD, which was 2 volumes, enormous amount of field research, you know, reconnaissance research. You know, I couldn't get that book published. It was a book about a Dalit community in northern India. And that book, by the way, is circulates in that community by PDF because people find it very useful in their own lives and struggles and so on. But I couldn't get that book published. And it struck me at that. And then when it was eventually published, it was attacked by all the scholars in the academic journals. And I actually came to an understanding. It actually clarified something for me, which is that that's not my world, actually. Actually, it's not my world. I respect academic work enormously. You know, I respect it. I respect its protocols. I understand the importance of it, you know, and I think it must grow and develop and strengthen some of its protocols, and people need to be serious. That's another world, though. What I was interested in is just the following proposition, that there are enormous libraries which have enormous amounts of incredible information. And then there are hundreds of millions, billions of people out there who have no access to these libraries. They don't know what's in them. And, you know, what had happened in a way to scholarship is that scholars began to write for each other. And it became like a kind of monastic religious exercise. And I thought about 20 years ago, you know what, I'm going to just, my job is not that. My job is piracy. I'm going to go into the library. I'm going to read tons of stuff. And then I'm just going to open a funnel and try to funnel out as much information as I can to people. So the second book I wrote, Karma of Brown Folk, was basically written formally for people who don't have any idea about academic debates. And, you know, and in fact, it puzzled people in the academy because how do you review a book like that? You know, it doesn't fit any protocol. It was very successful. It made my career in a way more than the book where I spent years researching. You know, this was like a runaway bestseller. And that's not what motivated me, though. What motivated me was going there. And so for the last 20 years, I've written, you know, you say you've written 30 books. Well, you know, it's not exactly like an academic's book. I mean, Washington Bullets is 100 pages long. You know, there's an enormous amount of reading in each of these. I grant you, Red Star with the Third World is 130 pages long. Huge amount of reading. But I just wanted to take everything I learned, like that annoying person who's just finished reading a book and then comes out and wants to tell you everything they read. I want my books to be a little bit like that annoying person who's just read a book that's fascinating, 500-page book about, World War II in China, and they just want to come and tell you everything, but they want to tell you everything in an hour.
I don't find that annoying at all, by the way, Vijay. So keep doing what you're doing. Brett, what do you want to add to this?
Yeah, just to take the conversation forward a little bit, I really want to sort of think about the importance of mass support with a lot of these things and the process of education. Because when you look at places like Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba specifically, we see that there's mass support, and we see that the people themselves are, because of their experiences and their leaders, have been very educated on the machinations of Western imperialism, how it operates, and that allows them to more effectively fight back. You can think of the Bay of Pigs, and you can think of these recent coup attempts in Venezuela and Bolivia that in large part were beaten back because of that mass support of the people. So I was hoping that you can kind of talk about the importance of that and just the way that manifests in different contexts.
Some of this is a learning experience, because when the Guatemala coup was happening in 53, it turned out that, Che Guevara was there. In 54, sorry, Che Guevara was there in Guatemala City, and he experienced what was going on. And he writes that he was frustrated that the government didn't arm the people, didn't arm their main support base and so on. So when the Cuban Revolution takes place, there's a couple of things that the Cuban leadership does, which is really very important, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of it. A lesson learned in Venezuela. One is that you have to constantly educate the public. It's one thing for people in countries like in the West, where there's, much higher rates of literacy, there's more access to universities. Then they can easily mock, when Castro would speak for 6 hours, they'd mock that as a kind of the ramblings of a authoritarian or whatever it is. But if you're a Cuban, you don't see it like that. You see that as your university education. This is very important. It's funny that you'll mock Castro for giving a long speech, but you'll be okay for spending 6-8 hours going from one class to the other, getting lectures in your university. Somehow 8 hours of lectures is okay in a day, but 8 hours of Professor Castro giving you a full sense of world international relations, of the situation in the Cuban sugar industry, going over statistics, explaining the problems of electricity. I mean, Castro's speeches were a tour de force in conjunctural analysis. If you go back and read his speeches, he was an educator of his country, a country which didn't have levels of education for historic reasons, and that was to, in the battle of ideas, school the people. Tell the people, this is where we're at. You know what? We failed in the Cuban harvest. Castro's most amazing speeches were after defeat. Not only 1953, history will absolve me, after Moncada, but when the 1970 sugarcane harvest speech, incredible. He goes to the people and explains why Cuba is in difficulty, and he says, I want to resign. And they say, no, you can't resign. People yell from the crowd, we don't want you to resign. When the Soviet Union collapses, he gives a series of addresses which explain what happened. And it's really very informative. And so that's one, public demonstrations and these speeches, it's not the ramblings of a megalomaniac. However, there's an annoying way in which, the imperialist core so quickly tries to delegitimize people. It doesn't see the social context, and as I said, it's perfectly okay to go to a speech, whatever in college or school, but this somehow is a bad thing. No, you don't agree with what he's saying. That's the problem. It's not that you're pissed off that he's speaking for, 3, 4, 6 hours. I've heard him speak. He's an incredible speaker. I would listen to him 3 days running. It's the best series of lectures that I've heard, But the second thing they did was that around the time of Bay of Pigs, they created the committees to defend the revolution in every single hamlet around Cuba, where they armed people. And I don't just mean militarily, they armed them organizationally. I'll give you an example what this means. When a hurricane is tearing towards Cuba, the Committee to Defend the Revolution has, in any community, they have people who are electricians and understand electricity. They mobilize the committee, they go out there before the hurricane hits, and they disconnect power lines. They bring them down, okay? And they prepare. And then the hurricane goes through, because the hurricane is going to bring the power lines down. Once the hurricane has gone through, they get back and they reconnect. In Cuba, they lose power for the duration of the hurricane. You remember Puerto Rico? When the hurricane came, because the people are not organized, they're disarmed. By arming the people, it never means just guns. It means you organize people. That's what true arming the people means. The difference between Cuba in a hurricane and Puerto Rico in a hurricane is the difference between socialism and capitalism.
Yeah, so I think that you hit on something that's really key, is that we have to be prepared for being armed, whether that's in the sense of guns or in terms of just organization, before we actually need to be armed. We have to be prepared for the eventuality that we will need to be armed. And one of the examples that you used that I want to touch on, and we mentioned it in our introductory segment of this episode, is you mentioned the PAIGC of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. They were not originally a armed, militant, struggling organization, and that really only came to be an armed struggle after the Portuguese forced them to become an armed organization by massacring people in those areas. You don't know when you're going to be massacred. And of course, if you can avoid a violent armed struggle, of course, everybody is going to naturally say, we're going to want to avoid that. But when you're being massacred, the option for avoiding an armed struggle is no longer there. And I think that was a really informative example that you put in the book. And you're giving more examples now of, being armed doesn't necessarily require arms. You have to be armed for any eventuality. And a lot of these different societies and systems don't allow for the arming of the citizenry. And I think that that's something that we really need to take out of your work here, is that we need to be prepared, and people worldwide need to be prepared for every eventuality, because you never know when these things are going to be coming. Do you want to comment on that before I move us on to another topic, Vijay?
Well, you raised the PAIGC. This is the party in Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, led by Amilcar Cabral. There's a superb book by Sonia Vaz Borges about the militant education of the PAIGC. In fact, for Tricontinental, she's written a 3,500-word document about their militant education, which we'll bring out soon. You see, because they understood, yes, they begin as a legal civic organization, to raise people's confidence to struggle against colonialism. There's a massacre, then they have to move. Their armed struggle is imposed on them. This is what happens in almost every theater. In almost every national liberation situation, armed struggle is imposed. In South Africa, Mandela and others, they create the sword of the nation, because it is imposed on them. They start out with court cases and so on, and then they have to go underground, and then sabotage operations, then an armed struggle, and so on. It's imposed by power. Power never gives things up. Remember Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. But now, wait a minute. Frederick Douglass, this is not enough. Power never concedes anything without a demand. But then when you demand something, they try to kill you. And so you have to defend yourself. And now the question is how? It's not always with guns. And it's important. I just want to underscore that, because the PAIGC, in the middle of an armed struggle, recognized the most important thing you arm people with is history, with sociology, and with an understanding of the technical capacities needed to build a society. So they taught them history. What is our history? What is our history as opposed to their history? What they're telling us is our history. What is our real history? That's one thing. What is our sociology? What kind of society do we live in? What are the different ethnic communities? Why is it that we are told we are fighting each other? This is both historical and sociological. You need to understand how sociologically people are, and economically confronting each other. And finally, you have to be armed with competence. You have to study agronomy. You have to study, seed science. You have to study all these important things so that you can build a society in the future. And that's weaponry. Cabral comes to Havana in 1966 and gives an important address at the Tricontinental Conference called the Weapon of Theory. In this address called the Weapon of Theory, he makes this point. It's a range of things. It includes the armed struggle because they are forcing us to fight. They're coming and killing us. But it also includes education. because education is weapons. It's armor for people. It helps you protect your dignity. If you believe, as Fanon and others have written, if you believe that what the colonizer is telling you is what is real about you, you will have no dignity. You have to understand who you are to stand straight and confront the colonizer. And that's Fanon's, consistent point from black skin, white mask to Legend of the Earth. It's a consistent argument. If you don't have your own history, which is your real history, if you don't have, because everybody's history is dignified, everybody's history is dignified. Nobody has a history that is not dignified. You always have a history. Histories are complicated and contradictory, and there's bad sides and so on, but everybody has a history with dignity in it. You pull at that seam, pulling at that seam will strengthen your backbone. Then you will stand up for yourself. That's what arming is about. The gun is a side, that's a tactic. Weapons are a tactic. The strategy is to stand upright. Why did Sankara take Upper Volta and change the name to Burkina Faso? Burkina Faso means the land of upright people.
Great. So I think, you covered that really well. And what I want now is, I know that the three of us, when we read your book, we came out with a lot of messages and epiphanies, you could say, that I think that the vast majority of the listeners won't have been exposed to. So first of all, everybody buy Washington Bullets and read it. It's a very fast read. You get a lot out of it. But guys, I guess let's bring up some of the things that we thought were really, critical out of the book, and maybe some questions for Vijay that are related to these epiphanies that we've had. I know that one of the ones that I had was regarding the AFL-CIA, but I've been talking too much, so I guess let's turn it over to the guys first. And if we got time for the AFL-CIA towards the end, we'll get to that, because that is something that I would like Vijay to talk about.
Well, we shouldn't go too far away from that. That was a very interesting episode. I think one of the things that was so good about the book is identifying the operations during this so-called Cold War, because it wasn't cold in the Third World, as you point out, but the way in which the United States had to enlist intellectuals, artists, and cultural figures, and left labor and other leftist groups within the United States, and to make those sorts of alliances because their real task was somehow to convince people, not to go for the real option that was available, right? Of genuine social revolution, worker control, these sorts of things. So they had to kind of adapt their message, and really their targets were the liberals, in a way, in these societies. And so I think that would be very interesting to talk a little bit more about the enlisting of some of these other groups, like the intellectuals, like cultural figures. You talked, for example, quite a lot about the importance of the Bandung Conference as this marking out of a new direction for post-colonial states, and the trajectory that emerges of the non-aligned movement, and then the more radical dimensions of it in the Tricontinental. But somebody who covered this, a former Marxist, African-American writer of the left, Richard Wright, writes The Color Curtain. He's sponsored and funded clearly by the CIA's organs for cultural dissemination of liberal, anti-communist sorts of ideas. And it's quite a shocking read when you read it. It's full of its own bigotry and patronizing racism. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way in which the kind of amnesia you're fighting against is also created by all of these obfuscatory intellectual and cultural enlistments by power.
Yeah, this is a very interesting part of it, because this comes straight to the question of the battle of ideas. From the 1940s, in fact, earlier, before the CIA was founded, during the time of the OSS, and I mean, way back, this goes beyond U.S. history and it was always clear that you win when you win the argument. You can suppress somebody, you can dominate somebody, and you can terrify them. You can rule by fear. Machiavelli has a section on this. It's better not to rule by fear, actually. It's better to rule by winning the argument. What the Russians called hegemony, which then Gramsci takes the term from Russian debates, and then it enters in a very bizarre way in the American Academy. But the idea of hegemony was to win the argument. That was the idea. And the CIA was adept at this. I mean, listen, these people, the bosses at the CIA, they all studied at Harvard, at Yale. They know history very well. They often studied, history or literature, things like that. They understood that you had to win the argument. And they also understood that you can win the argument powerfully. You didn't have to actually win the argument. You enlist people to force the argument through. For instance, the media. You call up the New York Times and you tell them that coverage is not appropriate. We want you to send this reporter to Cuba. We want you to send that reporter to Guatemala. That's it, and they would, because why? They all went to Harvard and Yale together. They were friends. There was not even the need to twist anybody's arm. They agreed with each other at that level. So, we have ample evidence of these mainstream newspapers seeding reporters on behalf of the CIA. And I'm sure this happens till today. I'm sure this happens now. Phone calls are made, maybe not phone calls, maybe signal messages are sent, little whispers at some club in New York City, etc., etc. It's taken care of. We know this stuff happens. So media, you start getting favorable reporting in the mainstream media. Oh my Lord. The Guardian in Britain should be ashamed of saying congratulatory, stories on Mas's victory in Bolivia, because last year they basically went along with the OAS. And who, pays the piper calls the tune. And I don't know who pays the piper. Francis Saunders wrote a terrific book about this called Who Pays the Piper. I've forgotten, the American edition had a different name. Oh, it was called The Cultural Cold War. The Cultural Cold War. It's an excellent book. It's about how the CIA finances art so that, what's his name with the throwing of paint on the canvas?
Jackson Pollock.
Jackson Pollock suddenly becomes heroic because they were trying to, set aside not just realism, but art that was left political. And instead you suddenly get this emergence of, abstraction, Rauschenberg, and this stuff, which is, let's face it, it's not unattractive. But what is it saying? I mean, you smash up cars and then you spray paint them and put it in the gallery. I mean, a generation before this, Dali, I think, put a toilet bowl, or was that Marcel Duchamp put a toilet bowl in a gallery, and said, behold, this is what the CIA funds. And Frances Saunders, she demonstrates it. And then you get Lane Kirkland and the CIA. I mean, sorry, the AFL-CIO, the labor movement in the United States, which in the United States had made its compromise with capitalism. This was known as business unionism. And so Kirkland led the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Unions, AFL-CIO, into basically bed with the American capitalists. And then further, even more disgraceful, into bed with the CIA, and participated through these training, the military, US military, will bring soldiers and officers from outside to train with them and basically be bribed, like Manuel Noriega, to go back and become agents of the CIA in their country. The man, Williams Kaliman, who walks in there and tells Evo Morales, you got to get out of Bolivia, was trained in the United States. So that's what the military does. But so does the AFL-CIO. It brought these senior trade unionists. They got big stipends. They enjoyed the flavors and fruits of American life. And then they return home, and then suddenly you pull the chain on them and say, now you got to do a demonstration against Chedi Jagan. And so it's a British official who says we shouldn't call them the AFL-CIO, we should call them the AFL-CIA. That is a stinging thing. I found that in the British, documents. That is a really stinging piece of British wit, because do you need to say any more? And I tell you something, that till today, the American labor movement, Canadian labor movement, none of them have apologized for their role in the coups which have been like the American labor movement should apologize to the Guyanese people for the coup against Chedi Jagan. It would be important as a gesture of solidarity. But you know why they don't apologize? Because I think they're still doing it.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that is really interesting here, so you just wrapping up on the AFL-CIO, is that, of course, labor unions in the U.S. By liberals, left liberals, they're always seen unequivocally as positive, but they were, kind of incorporated into the CIA as an apparatus for usage abroad. But Brett, what do you want to bring up?
Yeah, I want to continue this thinking about the CIA and how its machinations sort of operate. You talk about in the book a little bit about how these documents come out and sort of we can look back in retrospect and understand things. And, part of that, I think you mentioned something like a wink and a nod to their own power. Like they release these documents that are, showing what they're actually engaged in. But, what is the motivation for releasing them at all? And then if there is a time lapse between when they do the things and when the things come out, well, certainly we're probably still living in that moment now. And that's just to set up this question, which is I'm often interested in that shift towards the use of the rhetoric of human rights, the use of the rhetoric of authoritarianism as an ideological weapon that the U.S. does against its enemies to sort of clear the way for these sorts of activities and really gain support of the Western populations for these imperial adventures. Can you talk about the ideological use of human rights and authoritarianism?
Yeah, so this language goes back to World War II. This is not new language, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, it's really weaponized. It's an old language. I mean, you hear it. When I first read Hannah Arendt's book, Origins of Totalitarianism, I was horrified by this book. Everybody said, oh, it's a great book. It's a classic. You got to read it. I was at the University of Chicago doing my PhD. This university touts itself as a place of big ideas. And this is a book with a big idea, but it's a totally big idea that's useless, which is that communism and fascism are identical and they stand opposed to liberalism. And I read this thinking, I, as a communist, don't recognize communism in this book. I don't know what she's talking about. And by the way, why doesn't she talk about the fact that she thought Heidegger was a real thinker and not a Nazi, who should have been shunned? Like, why isn't that part of the conversation when we think about this book and blah, blah, blah? But from that book onward, we see this discourse of the free world. It's this discourse of the free world that is there from after, well, it's there during World War II, but it really picks up in the aftermath of World War II. That there is a free world and an unfree world. And this is an exhausting and suffocating discourse. It's brilliant because what more brilliant way to divide the world than by saying we are on the free side and there's an unfree side? Like, it's the most elegant thing. You'd think, what were the Soviets doing? Why didn't they do this before? Saying we are the free world, you are the unfree. Instead, they have said we are the proletarian world in terms that don't make sense to anybody. The most elegant thing is free and unfree, right? Hello, Hegel and so on, a whole tradition of thinking, freedom, and they take this elegant term and say we are free and you are unfree. And it's bizarre because we are free and yet we have Jim Crow laws in the United States, and yet Native Americans are on reservations, and yet, the situation for people of Latino background and so on is appalling and abysmal, and people whose land we seized in the war against Mexico are treated as second-class citizens even though they were there before us, and etc., etc., etc. Free and unfree. And this then after 91, this, because it's so sedimented in the global consciousness that this is the free world, that these are democracies. It's so sedimented, people have then there's no human rights problem in the West, but people around the world don't believe it because every time there's a George Floyd, every time there's an Eric Garner, it makes world news. Why? Because people are like, see that? This is what it really is. What it really is, they really suffocate somebody on the street. That's what it really is, but we can't say it because when we say it, we look absurd, eh? and B, they cut off our aid money or they bomb us or whatever it is. So there is a way in which people actually know this is BS. They know that the West is not free and democratic and so on because they taste the drones and the Hellfire missiles and they know what freedom is.
Yeah.
But you can't state. So it wins the ideological battle, even though culturally there are gaps. People don't believe it, but they can't change the ideological battle around. I think that's really where we're stuck. Why is the Human Rights Watch going after Venezuela so intensely? Where is the indignation when it comes to Colombia or to Brazil? The Human Rights Watch is totally weaponized to the State Department point of view.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia. And really quick, Adnan, before I let you go, I just wanted to mention it's also very useful using this anti-authoritarianism and human rights rhetoric to bring over liberals and left anti-communist in the imperial core, because that's the sort of rhetoric and language, often going back to Hannah Arendt type, totalitarian rhetoric, but that really can co-opt a segment of the left at least and push them towards even full-on supporting some of these imperialist actions.
Yeah, and Adnan, just sorry to also butt in right before you get in. I just wanted to bring up one other point that Vijay brought up in his book, which of course is something that is fairly well known, but a lot of liberals, people that would consider themselves liberals, don't really pay attention to, which is when we're labeling these countries free or unfree, one of the more recent classifications is that of a rogue state. And Vijay brings up the dichotomy between us labeling other nations, us being the US, labeling other nations as rogue states, whereas Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, is completely fine with more than 500,000 Iraqi children dying. We're not the rogue state. They're the rogue state. And this labeling really allows for basically the security apparatus to do whatever they want without any repercussions because it's justified. We're doing it against the rogue state. But anyway, Adnan, I'll let you go now.
Just to follow up with the continuing point, I think one of the things that the book does so well, and I really appreciated, Vijay, that you were doing, is that you connected that later hypocrisy about the free world as a discourse in post-World War II U.S. imperial discourse, but how it was embedded in a longer history of the colonial era and the way in which even the regimes that we think of as universalist and progressive, the founding of the UN and the logics behind it, but even before that, the way in which the world was sort of carved up, and international law was conceived as a regime for managing colonial and imperial competition with one another so that they wouldn't use, the native had to be uncivilized because otherwise there would be the temptation by the colonial powers to use this discourse of I'm doing this on behalf of this colonial native group or that, and that would cause rivalry between, the powers. So there was this kind of long history that's embedded even in the so-called universal logics and discourse and conceptions of things like international law and so on, that also was part of the contradiction you were getting at. It was an interesting contradiction of U.S.'s sort of anti-colonial discourse and sometimes anti-colonial policy when it was confronting Britain and France during World War II to give up their colonies so that the U.S. could penetrate these markets. They had an idea you should roll back colonial control of the old colonial powers, but at the same time, it quickly and swiftly moved into, retarding and stopping and suppressing anti-colonial movements in the actual third world. That in a way, it seemed that it came to your critique of the colonial context of the United States. You didn't talk as much about the fact that it's a particular kind of colony, like the settler, colonial context. Is very important in understanding why the United States, for its elite, its settler elite, developed this democratic ideals, liberal political philosophy, and so on. But at the same time, that could be conjoined with the policies of eradicating the indigenous people, enslaving others. And I thought also you could we talk about the Bolivarian Revolution, and it's turned into something that can be used as a progressive ideal. I know, in Venezuela, they talked about it a lot. But of course, even that were these plantation that wanted to break away from Spain. And it's very similar in some ways that these Republican ideals in the era of colonialism used democratic language and Republican ideals, but they were partly for this elite to better suppress and achieve their settler colonial projects. So perhaps that explains that contradiction, which I'd be interested a little bit more in you talking about, actually, that transition of the, apparently anti-colonial policies of the U.S., but then its quick, reconstruction of a neo-imperialist order.
Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, Simón Bolívar was interesting because Bolívar starts as a Creole planter class leader and then gets defeated. And then when he is in exile, makes a pledge against slavery and then assembles an army of, people of completely different backgrounds, including enslaved people. And when they are almost victorious, he's victorious because he changes. And that's the complete, Simón Bolívar is therefore the unity of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in a way. If Washington and Lincoln were not separated by so many generations, this is what happens in South America. I mean, it's a very interesting story because he was definitely from a position of weakness forced to go to the side of the masses. Actually, he doesn't use the masses for his ends. He actually declares that I accept your demands, and that's to the credit of the people who had been enslaved in South America, who actually had organized themselves and made demands. It's a very different kind of history, but the revival of Bolivar by Chavez was a very studious revival. Chavez thought hard about Bolivar, Robinson, the people around Bolivar, his advisors, and there's a reason he was very keen to bring that back into the national imaginary as a way to, in a way, confound Venezuela with its past. To say, look, Chavez was like Castro. He would give long historical speeches. He would explain to people who is, Simón Bolívar, who is Francisco Miranda, who is Robinson, because he said we need to go back to our history. It's not enough for us to learn U.S. history, to eat pasta, to try to become American. We need to understand the Bolivarian experience. We need to understand Patria Grande. We need to understand the whole area. It's fascinating how they mobilized history, which is where we began this, right? Mm-hmm. The United States is complicated because in the book I make the argument that in fact the American Revolution should be understood not as an anti-colonial revolution but as a revolution to colonize, because it's there in the material that the 13 colonies against the English yoke wanted to go outside and take the rest of the landmass, and England was busy making deals, and they were not interested in pissing the French off. They had all kinds of other things going on. It wasn't that the King of England was insane, which is oh God, please, Hamilton, what history lesson is that for kids, man? Oh God, appalling.
Terrible.
It's appalling. I mean, I'm all for popular history, but not this kind of crud, So then you can go out there and then you don't need to go overseas to colonize because you have more territory than you need. You first go all the way out, then you defeat Mexico in the war in the 1840s. You claim a third of Mexico all the way out to California. Then you can, purchase Alaska in what at the time looked like Seward's Folly, as they said, but then becomes important. You get Louisiana. And then after you've secured the territorial landmass, war with Canada was just a sideshow. You can go off and get Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii. I mean, there is no beginning of American colonialism in 1945. America begins as a colonial power. It's insane to forget this story, and it's insane to forget the territorial colonization. I'm not asking people to go and read Hitler's Mein Kampf, but on the other hand, in Hitler's Mein Kampf, he has a huge section where he's saying that, look, what I want to do as the Nazi project in Europe, I want to do the Anschluss, to take Austria, then I want to take the Slavic people. What I want to do is what the Americans did to the Native Americans, he writes. He at length explains the genocide of the Native Americans. He said, what they did was correct. We want to do the same to the Slavs. hello, America, you want to know what you did? What you did was basically what the Nazis were not able to do. That's what's scary. You know what's scary? Is not that you defeated the Nazis, but you fulfilled the Nazi program. Generations before the Nazis saw their program in your history.
And that's exactly what Césaire says as well. There's all of in discourse on colonialism is that this has happened in the colonies to peoples around the world all the time. The reason why we're crying bloody murder about Nazism is that he did it to Europe and to Europeans. That's the difference. Yeah.
So I know that we could keep Vijay all day. We have a lot of things planned, but we got to be respectful of Vijay's time. So Brett, I'll let you ask if you have any final points that you want to raise to Vijay since...
Sure. So yeah, the way I wanted to sort of, dive in towards the end of this conversation is to think about what we know about imperialism in the past and then perhaps project forward. One of the things that I think puts a unique spin on going forward is particularly the climate crisis. And on the liberal left in America, we hear all this talk of green capitalism. And I think what that will actually turn out to be in practice is more of this global north plundering of the global south, the extraction of stuff like lithium, right, to bring back and put in Tesla car batteries, for example. And it's going to have this liberal facade of being very progressive here at home while it continues the same project abroad. So just with what you know about imperialism, where do you see things going in the near to medium term future on that front?
I want to piggyback onto that, if I may. So again, just Brett makes an excellent point of global north versus global south. And I wanted to raise one final point from the book before we let Vijay answer that question and then we thank him. One of the things that you mentioned in the book was that the Cold War, we're thinking about it wrong. We tend to think of it as East versus West, USSR versus US, and all of these proxies, but really it's global North versus global South, powers of colonialism versus anti-colonialism. So I guess if you're able to address that North versus South, along with Brett's point about this eco-capitalism that we're seeing and exploitation of the global South. And then we'll thank you and get you out of here.
Okay. Well, that's the heart of the book in a way, is the rather broad argument is periodization. That, if you accept the periodization of the Cold War and then the post-Cold War, and, this periodization comes to us from the man. They have told us that there's a post-Cold War era. I'm not sure what they're talking about. Or, they said there was a hot era of the Cold War, then there was more détente. I mean, I don't even know what they're talking about, because right through all that, if you look at the history of the world from the standpoint of, let's say, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, doesn't look like there's been much, periodization necessary. That we need to rethink our periodization. And, well, there certainly was a break in the early 1960s from the previous history. And maybe there was a break in 1908 when, Leopold III had to essentially give up direct control of the Congo. So there's periodization within this, but it's not exactly a Cold War post. Where's the post-Cold War? It hasn't appeared in the world yet. So that's very much part of the book. And I won't say more about that because you can read up on that. It's a key part of the argument in the book. Well, I got to say, coming back to Bolivia, when the coup happened, I wrote a series of articles. One of them, actually, Noam Chomsky and I wrote 2 days before the coup, warning that there's a coup coming and people need to be out there banging the drums. And, I called Noam and said, Noam, I got a call from La Paz. This is serious. And up in Cochabamba, they're afraid that they might try to kill Morales. And he was like, okay, let's do something. We released a statement immediately. And then the coup happened. And I was very worried that night they were going to kill Morales. I was very, very worried about that. And in fact, he was worried. He skipped town. Then he went off to Mexico, made a deal, went to Mexico, and then eventually to Argentina. But when that was happening, I wrote a series of articles in which I said that this is a coup against the resource socialism of the Mars government. And I mentioned the lithium, but I actually don't think I used the phrase lithium coup, but I did say that it's lithium, it's indium. I wrote a series of things saying when Bolivia is thick with these, important minerals, and Canadian mining companies want them, US mining companies want them, and the Chinese were getting good deals, and there's a clash here. And that jerk Elon Musk, scion of a South African apartheid family, went to a private all-white school. Elon Musk wants his tentacles are going to go, and then I wrote all this stuff. I admit it, okay? Then I got attacked from people saying you're a conspiracy theorist, that this is nothing to do with, and continues. Somebody wrote something recently, and I was sent that, he and Morales, myself and Morales, concocted this false story that it's a lithium coup. Okay, this went around, and I was thinking, seriously? Okay, fine. I don't care. I don't have to answer you. This is what I believe. I think they're there for the minerals, because here's what's happening is you're talking about a Green New Deal, which is going to rely, it certainly may transition away from fossil fuels, but it's going to rely, because you don't have battery capacity in any other way than using things like cobalt, lithium, and so on. Because solar, because even water, hydropower, wind power needs batteries, because it's irregular power. Unlike fossil fuels, you need batteries. The best battery agents we have are these. And when you're talking cobalt, you're talking about copper tailings and so on in the Congo, and those are highly exploited miners, often children and so on. Terrible situation. The biggest company there is a former U.S. company now domiciled in Switzerland called Glencore. Big in the cobalt mining, and then lithium, which is Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Now, it's true that there's a lot of lithium is mined in Australia and so on, but this is where the bulk of it is. And if green is going to explode, this was the future. This is the money lithium. There's lithium in Cornwall, by the way, in the UK. But I don't think they're going to allow that to be majorly mined, because it's so beautiful and, not in my backyard. You'll screw up the great salt flats of Chile and so on. You're not going to screw up Cornwall. And Australia is basically what is being used now. When the expansion happens, it's Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. And this is of concern to me that, liberals and so on in the West touting the Green New Deal. It's not that the Bolivians don't want to export their lithium. And, I know there's a radical environmentalist section that says, Morales didn't tend. Listen, the Bolivians had the best climate argument. About 10 years ago, they released a global plan on climate. Nobody takes that seriously. In fact, I was talking to Nick Estes, of the Red Nation, and he was saying the conversation around climate shouldn't begin with the Green New Deal as if it's been invented in Europe or the United States. It should begin in Bolivia, where they've been talking about this Pachamama, a good life and so on for the last couple of decades. But you're still attacking Morales, saying he's anti-environmental, when your great environmental project is going to rely essentially on the destruction of indigenous communities around the world. I mean, what the hell is this? You're weaponizing environmentalism. Pablo Solon, former minister in Morales' government, is really the key person here. You're weaponizing environmentalism to attack Morales, who was one of the world's leaders on the issue of the environment. That doesn't mean his government doesn't do things like build a road in the Amazon. Because, there are contradictions in the world, okay? I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say it, okay? Nobody can live perfectly. You're sitting inside an area where you've clear-cut the whole forest, you're working on a high-speed computer, you're driving to Walmart to buy your shit, and you're accused of saying they shouldn't have a road through the Amazon. I mean, what the hell, man? Let's have some, basic decency when we have these discussions, You're flying all over the world at environmental conferences attacking Morales. I mean, good God, man, this is the one indigenous leader who was standing up at the UN and saying we need to do something much more than the Paris Agreement, and you're piling onto him. I mean, disgraceful, frankly, to your shame.
I think that speaks to a larger narrative against indigenous peoples by Westerners, particularly. I've seen a lot of Westerners talk about, how indigenous leaders or indigenous groups have not been environmentalists. Okay, well, let's have a little perspective here. But again, there's so much more that we could say Vijay Prashad. That was incredible. So I just want to pitch to everyone that's listening. Check out the Tricontinental Institute. And just got their newest newsletter today. And it's stuff that you're not going to see anywhere else. I'll just quote the very beginning of it from the 43rd newsletter from the Tricontinental. Any day now, Zambia will be the first African country to fall into a private debt default. And you talk about the IMF. And of course, the IMF plays a prominent role in Washington bullets. But where else are you going to hear about Zambia falling into private debt default? So the work that you're doing at Tricontinental is really invaluable, and everybody should go to the Tricontinental and sign up for the newsletter. But Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and author of the new book, Washington Bullets, out from Leftward Books. How can our listeners find you, and what are you working on now that you finished this book?
Well, firstly, the Tricontinental is an incredible team of over 30 people based in many countries, and we are backed and supported by political and social movements that are our heart and soul. So anything you read in any of our work, it comes from our movements. They have theorized us to where we are. And I'm not just saying that, I'm actually telling you the truth. This is exactly how it works. People should go and look at the material. We have a dossier coming out next month, which is on the impact of Paulo Freire on South African liberation struggles, and where our team interviewed people in the South African liberation movement to talk about the impact of pedagogy of the oppressed, but also to learn from our Brazilian comrades about the impact of the South African liberation struggle on pedagogy of the oppressed. It's a really interesting story, and they've done a terrific 3,500 word dossier on it with lovely illustrations and so on. So yeah, please, by all means, I agree with you. Go and look at the website. I'm working on a book now about, I have a book coming out in a couple of weeks, actually, edited book called Viviremos, Venezuela versus Hybrid War. And it'll be out from Leftward, but also international publishers in New York. And it's edited along with Manola de los Santos and Claudia de la Cruz. And it has a preface from Carlos Ron, who is the director of the Simon Bolivar Institute in Caracas. It's a great volume. It takes the piss out of the whole sanctions thing. It has a speech by Samuel Moncada, who's the Venezuelan permanent representative to the UN. Essays from a range of people. Belen Fernandez, terrific writer. Anya Parampil, who's with the Gray Zone. It's got terrific essays. Some of them are funny, even though it's a really difficult issue we're dealing with here. So I recommend. It's called Viviremos, which, if you remember, Chavez took the Cuban slogan, Venceremos, we will overcome. And he added to it, it was Viviremos y venceremos. We will live and we will overcome. And so we call the book Viviremos. And the subtitle is, it's basically classic cage wrestling, Venezuela versus hybrid war.
Great. Well, we'll probably try to bring you back after that's released to talk about that. But Vijay, you have an excellent Twitter page. Tell our listeners how to follow you on Twitter.
I think it's just my name. It's at Vijay Prashad, I think. And it's basically a great way to blow off steam. And, nobody should live their life attempting to always be serious in every way. Intellectuals particularly should not pretend that they smoke a pipe and wear a blazer and have an air of superiority and seriousness. And what I love about Twitter is that Twitter gives me the opportunity to be a human being and just have fun and playful and say things that are on my mind and then just go away. And I think intellectual activity, we just need to take the air out of that balloon. There's just a lot of pompousness and superiority. And I mean, you're smart and you read a lot of books, but you don't have to keep laying that on people, relax, like smile and aren't you an idiot sometimes in the day? Don't you like music? I mean, you're a human being. And I think that's all I'm going to say.
Amen. Well, I think we've had a lot of fun in this conversation too. So we really, really appreciate not only your knowledge, but also your generosity in sharing it and the conversational way and fun way in which we've been able to engage with you.
Yeah. Thanks, Vijay. Thanks for coming. And we'll be right back with more on guerrilla history. Man, that was quite the interview that we had there with Vijay. What did you guys think about it? Brett, I guess we'll start with you. What did you think about our interview with Vijay?
Yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, Vijay is an incredibly personable human being. And so there's a little nervousness when you have somebody as big as Vijay come on a show, especially when you're just trying to find out who you are as a show. And so to have him have that just very welcoming, open, laughing personality was wonderful and put us all at ease, I think. But something he said in the beginning, I think, is worth, re-entrenching sort of. And that's this idea of good people and equipping good people with the knowledge they need to try to make the world a better place. And very often, whether we talk about political theory or we do academic discussions of history or even some strains of the Marxist left, there's this sort of pushing away of the subjective of morality as superstructural phenomena that we don't need to place too much focus on. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of people are truly inspired because of their humanity. They're truly inspired by this burning sense of love and compassion for other human beings. And so to play that up and to talk and to appeal to people's better natures and to try to appeal to their humanity, I think is an important part of everything that we're doing, and it should not be dismissed. He talked about the dignity in people's histories and how certain figures can help bring that out. And certainly, we in our intro, we have Malcolm X talking. And one of his great contributions to Black radicalism in the U.S. was precisely this love yourself. He has these speeches where he talks about, love the way that you look. Everything that the white man tries to tell you is ugly or lesser than about you, embrace it and turn that into something that you find beautiful about yourself. And that expression of self-love then, I think, transformed through the Black Panther Party and into hip-hop itself, which I think is a fascinating sort of trajectory that you can trace stemming out of Malcolm X and, of course, before him with people like Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, etc. But I think that's an incredibly important thing, and that's something that Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth did as well. Thinking about the human psyche and the human fight for dignity and standing up on your own 2 feet and looking your oppressor in the eye and how that's a dignifying process. And then the other thing that stuck out to me was when he talks about arming the people in places like Cuba and Bolivia and Venezuela. He's like, guns are one part of it, but the other 2 parts of it are education and organization. So when we talk about these movements arming the people, arming them with knowledge, arming them with organizational capacity, and then arming them with actual weaponry to defend the revolution. And I think that's a very crucial thing, particularly in some segments of the Western left, where I think there can be this fetishization of violence and this sort of abstract revolutionaryism, but without these other components really taken seriously. So I just really appreciated that about him.
Yeah, and I'm just going to draw the interconnection between these shows again. Brett, you had an excellent episode on Red Menace with your co-host, Allison Escalante, on Wretched of the Earth. So for listeners who want to become more familiar with that work, definitely check out that episode on the Red Menace podcast. Adnan, what did you think of our conversation with Vijay?
Well, I think it was a perfect inaugural episode because it really, in 2 ways, it really covered wide-ranging terrain that I hope we'll be able to follow up with some more specific episodes, but he gave such a wonderful, synthetic, overarching sense of the terrain of history that we're interested in for contemporary struggles. And 2, his approach is so compatible with the purpose behind this podcast. I mean, he has been doing essentially a kind of guerrilla history, and one thing that really I appreciated very much is how he said that the audience for his work really was young activists to be able to crystallize some key understanding and to arm them with the kind of knowledge that they need about the way in which the CIA's imperialist program for regime change is actually a playbook that has a historical pattern. And when you're immersed in one particular context, you may not see it. So being armed with this knowledge really helps prepare people for how to respond to it, how to recognize it. And so I think that was something that was very important to come out of the conversation and come out of his work. So I think in some ways he's sort of the ideal figure to talk about history for contemporary struggles. Like, there doesn't need to be a lot of analysis from us to take a discussion of history and figure out how it can be useful. That's what his whole work, his body of work is about. And certainly this book, Washington Bullets, does that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll give my thoughts on the conversation before I pitch it back to you guys for just any final thoughts on Washington Bullets as a book, or how it integrates with the conversation that we had. But what I want to say is that this conversation was really important because Vijay brought up something in the conversation I didn't think came out in the book. It didn't come out in the book particularly, which the book was quite almost fatalistic in a way, which is something that we see pretty frequently. There's very, very seldom this middle ground that we are able to tread. You either have people that are naive as to how difficult it actually is to affect meaningful change in a society because they're unaware or just ignorant as to the sort of forces that are pushing back against them. And, whether that's within the United States or outside of the United States, a lot of these people don't necessarily think of how the CIA are pushing against them both overtly as well as covertly, how the IMF is pushing against them, how NGOs have infiltrated them. And that was something that we didn't get to talk about in the interview, is the infiltration of NGOs in Haiti, which I think is something that a lot of people don't think about as a way of controlling a populace as well as policy within that area. But alas, that's something that's happening. So you either have people that are ignorant as to quite how difficult it is to affect change within their personal lives as well as societally. And then on the other hand, you have people who maybe are informed about it. Maybe they've read the Washington Bullets, who knows? But they're aware of all of these external forces on them, and they become fatalistic in a way. They come to think, is it really worth the struggle? Because we have all of these external forces pushing against us. There's no way that we can really overcome that. But the conversation with Vijay, both by talking about the information about these external forces that are pressing against you so that we're not ignorant, but getting that hope that, Brett, you brought up at the beginning of the conversation, Adnan, you talked about earlier, getting this hope that, yes, it's difficult. We have to understand that it is difficult. We have to understand why it's difficult. But by having that knowledge, we can then have the hope that we actually will change things because we have examples of where good people make change. And as we said, it's just a few days before we recorded this. I don't know how it'll come out temporally based on when this episode actually drops, but the election of Mas back in Bolivia is an example, and Vijay used it as a very fitting example of how good people can affect change. And that should give us hope despite the forces that we have pressing against us. So do either of you have any other final thoughts that we want to conclude with before we wrap this up?
Sure. Yeah. Quickly, my final thoughts, and just, harping on that idea of optimism and hope, which brings us back to sort of dialectics. And it's not some abstract in the clouds thing. It's a very real thing. And one of the things that dialectics tells us is wherever there is repression, wherever there is occupation, domination, exploitation, there's also simultaneously the seeds of the rebellion against that state of affairs. And as things get worse, as fascism becomes more resurgent, as climate change bears down on us, as all these contradictions become increasingly harder and harder to buffer by ideology and ignore, I do believe there are enough good people in this world that will continue to wake up and to rise up. And I don't know exactly how that will happen. I don't know exactly how all those things will play out, how organized things will be. But there is that level of resistance, and it's always going to be there, and it upticks with the uptick of repression and domination. And if nothing else from all of this history, wherever there's been imperialist domination and bloodshed and slaughter, as tragic and as horrifying as that history is, there is also always people fighting back, always good people willing to even sacrifice their own life to make things better for others. And that's the tradition that we stand in, and that can give us not only the dignity of our history, as Vijay would put it, but also a vision for how we can move forward and continue to do our work in a vein that is optimistic. You know, as Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And that's the middle way, I think, that you're getting at, Henry.
Yeah, exactly. Adnan, final word?
I would echo that. I think what I really appreciated since reading it, it was a disturbing retailing of all the ways in which U.S. empire has derailed progressive leftist movements, people's movements, that he did really have an analysis that should be encouraging because he's arming us with tools from history in our plans to win. And that is indeed, it's not just about the struggle, but it's about effective engagement. It's about effective struggle with the goal and the objective to create a better society. That's what we're after. And I think this history really helped us see some of the ways in which we can be prepared to achieve that purpose.
Yeah, excellent. So, Adnan, Brett, thanks for coming in and sharing this conversation with me. It was a lot of fun, really informative. Brett, how can our listeners follow you on social media?
On social media, you can just go to @RevLeftRadio, and that's on Twitter. And under the Twitter, there's a link to our website if you can find our Patreon, our sister podcast, etc.
And everybody should go and listen to Rev Left Radio and Red Menace and donate to those shows' Patreon pages. They're really incredible resources for thought on the left. Adnan, how can our listeners find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein, 1 S, all one word. And if you're also interested in the Middle East, Islamic world, I also have a podcast called The Majlis Podcast, which is sponsored by the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project I direct at Queen's University.
Excellent. And as for me, you can follow me on Twitter at Huck1995, and you can join me on Patreon. I write about public health and science primarily, patreon.com/Huck1995. Thanks a lot, guys. Looking forward to our next conversation. Solidarity with both of you and solidarity with the listeners.